Most people think toxic people are the problem. But the uncomfortable truth is this: toxic people are not the real issue. Your reaction is, because the moment someone can pull you into emotion, they are no longer just around you. They are inside your head, shaping your thoughts, influencing your decisions, and quietly stealing your peace without asking permission. And here is what nobody tells you. Toxic people don't need control over your life. They only need control over your reaction. If they can get you angry, they've already won a piece of your clarity. If they can get you defensive, they've already shifted your focus away from your goals. If they can get you emotionally involved, they've already taken you out of your power without touching anything physical. That's why some people stay stuck for years, not because their life is difficult, but because they are emotionally available to every form of negativity that enters it. But high-value people operate differently. They don't argue to prove worth. They don't react to every insult. They don't explain themselves to people committed to misunderstanding them. And they don't fight battles that were never worth their energy in the first place. Because they understand something most people never learn: the strongest form of power is not reaction, it is restraint. And the moment you master restraint, something shocking happens. The same people who used to disturb your peace can no longer reach you the same way. Their words still exist, but they lose impact. Their behavior still happens, but it loses control over you. And that is when you realize something life-changing. You were never trapped by toxic people. You were only trapped by how much you responded to them. And once that realization hits, everything changes. You know what most people get wrong about toxic behavior? They think it's about disrespect. They think it's about personality clashes. They think it's about standing up for themselves, proving a point, or making sure the other person knows how they feel. But in reality, toxic dynamics are rarely about truth. They are about control. And control doesn't come from strength. It comes from reaction. The moment you react emotionally without thinking, you are no longer in control of the situation. You have just handed control to the other person, because now they are not responding to you. They are shaping you. They are pressing buttons, watching your response, and adjusting their behavior based on how predictable your emotions are. That is the hidden structure of toxic interaction most people never see. It's not loud in the beginning. It's subtle. It starts with small provocations, a comment that slightly crosses the line, a joke that feels off, a tone that carries disrespect but is wrapped in just kidding. And when you react, even slightly, the pattern is reinforced. And here is the psychological truth. Whatever gets a reaction gets repeated. If anger gets a reaction, anger returns. If sarcasm gets a reaction, sarcasm escalates. If guilt trips get a reaction, they become more refined. Not because the other person is always consciously evil, but because the dynamic itself is being trained like a system. Behavior is reinforced through response. So when we say high-value people don't react, we are not talking about suppression. We are talking about awareness. There is a difference between feeling something and feeding something. High-value people feel everything, but they don't feed everything. They don't take every emotional trigger and turn it into action. They don't confuse impulse with intelligence. They don't believe that silence means weakness or that restraint means defeat. In fact, they understand something most people never learn in their entire life. Not responding is still a response. It is a message, a very clear one. It communicates, you do not get access to my emotional system on demand. And that single message changes the entire structure of the relationship. Because toxic people are not adapted to resistance. They are adapted to reaction. They can escalate chaos, but they struggle to operate in the absence of it. When there is no emotional fuel, their influence starts to collapse. Think of it like a fire. A fire does not argue with water. It simply cannot survive it. And emotional composure works the same way. When you remove the fuel of reaction, the fire of manipulation does not get stronger. It disappears. But here is where most people misunderstand this concept and fail to apply it. They think don't react means do nothing internally. So they bottle everything up. They stay quiet on the outside, but become chaotic on the inside. They replay conversations. They rehearse arguments. They mentally defend themselves hours after the moment has passed. That is not control. That is delayed reaction. High-value behavior is not about suppressing emotion. It is about processing it without broadcasting it. You can notice disrespect without engaging it. You can recognize manipulation without entering it. You can understand someone's intent without playing into their game. That is emotional intelligence in real time. And when you operate from that level, something very interesting happens. People who rely on emotional disruption start to lose interest in you. Not because you defeated them, not because you outsmarted them in some dramatic confrontation, but because the system they depend on no longer works. There is no feedback loop, no spike, no reaction to feed on, and without that, the dynamic collapses on its own. This is why silence is not emptiness. It is structure. It is a boundary without aggression. It is clarity without explanation. It is strength without performance. But you have to understand something deeper here. The goal is not to become cold. The goal is to become unshakable. Cold people disconnect from emotion. Unshakable people master it. Cold people avoid. Unshakable people choose. Cold people withdraw out of fear. Unshakable people stand still out of control. And that difference is everything. Because in life, you will always encounter people who test limits. Not everyone does it with malice. Some do it out of habit. Some do it out of insecurity. Some do it because they have never faced resistance before. But regardless of intention, your response defines your experience. If you react to everything, you become accessible to everything. If you respond intentionally, you become accessible only to what you allow. And that is where power quietly enters the picture. Not loud power, not aggressive power, but composed power. The kind of power that does not need to announce itself because it is already established in how you carry yourself. So when someone tries to pull you into emotional chaos, you don't need to win the argument. You don't need the perfect comeback. You don't need to explain your entire perspective so they finally understand. You only need one decision. Do I enter this, or do I observe it from distance? Because the moment you step inside unnecessary conflict, you are no longer observing reality. You are participating in distortion. And high-value people don't live in distortion. They live in clarity. So the next time someone tries to provoke you, interrupt your peace, or drag you into emotional reaction, remember this: you are not proving your strength by reacting. You are revealing your strength by choosing not to. And in that moment of restraint, you are doing something most people will never understand. You are taking back control without saying a single word, and that is where real power begins. Because once you stop reacting to everything, everything stops controlling you. Most people never realize this, but your energy is not just something you have. It is something you continuously spend. Every conversation you enter, every argument you engage in, every emotional reaction you give, every person you try to convince, it all costs something. Not in money, but in something far more limited. Your mental clarity, your emotional stability, your attention, your focus, your sense of peace. And once it is spent, you don't always get it back. This is why high-value people become extremely intentional about where their energy goes. Not because they are distant from life, but because they are deeply aware of how easily life can drain them if they are not conscious. Think about it. The average person doesn't lose energy in one big dramatic moment. They lose it in small leaks throughout the day. A pointless argument that goes nowhere. A toxic conversation that repeats the same pattern. A need to explain themselves to someone who never intended to understand. A situation they should have walked away from, but stayed in just to make their point. And after enough of these small leaks, they don't feel powerful anymore. They feel tired. Not physically, but mentally exhausted, emotionally overloaded, spiritually drained. That is the cost of unprotected energy. Now here is the deeper truth most people miss. Toxic environments don't take your energy. You give it away when you try to control what was never yours to control. You cannot control how others think. You cannot control how others behave. You cannot control how others interpret you. But the moment you try, you enter a losing game. Because now your focus is no longer on your life. It is on managing someone else's mind. And that is one of the fastest ways to lose yourself without even noticing it. High-value people understand this early. They realize something powerful. Not every situation deserves their attention. Not every opinion deserves a response. Not every person deserves access to their mental space. Because attention is not neutral. Attention is investment. Where you place it, you are building something. And either peace or chaos. Either clarity or confusion. Either direction or distraction. So they start filtering. Not emotionally, not reactively, but intentionally. They ask a simple internal question before engaging anything. Is this worth my energy, or is this just trying to take it? And that question alone changes everything. Because suddenly, you are no longer pulled into every emotional invitation. You are no longer available for every conflict. You are no longer mentally open to every opinion that passes by. You become selective. And selection is power. But let's go deeper. Toxic people often rely on one assumption, that your energy is unlimited, that you will always explain yourself, that you will always defend your name, that you will always stay in the conversation until it is resolved. But high-value individuals break that assumption completely. They don't stay in draining environments long enough to justify their existence. They don't keep conversations alive that have already shown their purpose. They don't continue cycles that have already proven to be repetitive. They end them internally before they end them externally. And this is where real strength appears. Because walking away is not always physical. Sometimes it is mental disengagement while still being present in the room. You can hear without absorbing. You can observe without reacting. You can be in a situation without being owned by it. That is energetic discipline. And it is one of the rarest forms of self-control. Most people confuse availability with strength. They think being constantly reachable, constantly responsive, constantly involved makes them valuable. But in reality, it makes them vulnerable. Because when your attention is always open, anything can enter it. And not everything that enters your mind deserves to stay there. High-value people protect their mental space the way others protect their home. They don't allow random disturbances to settle in. They don't invite unnecessary chaos inside just because it knocked on the door. They evaluate it. They filter it. And if it does not align with their peace, they do not engage. And this is where something interesting happens in relationships. When you stop over-investing your energy into people who are used to consuming it, they begin to notice a shift. At first, they may push harder. They may try new tactics. They may increase intensity to get the same reaction they used to receive. But when nothing works, when there is no emotional reaction left to extract, something changes in them. They either adapt or they withdraw, and both outcomes protect your peace. But here is the part that requires maturity. Protecting your energy does not mean becoming emotionally absent. It means becoming emotionally precise. You are not shutting the world out. You are simply refusing to waste yourself on situations that lead nowhere. Because life is not just about how much you can handle. It is about how much you choose not to carry. And that distinction is everything. High-value people are not tired because they do less. They are calm because they waste less. They don't burn energy proving things that don't need proof. They don't enter conflicts that don't deserve entry. They don't extend conversations that are already empty. They conserve themselves. And in a world that constantly demands reaction, attention, and emotional output, conservation becomes a form of intelligence. So when you start protecting your energy, something very subtle begins to change in your life. You stop feeling constantly drained. You stop feeling mentally scattered. You stop feeling emotionally pulled in multiple directions. And slowly, you start noticing something else. Clarity returns. Focus returns. Peace returns. Not because your environment changed immediately, but because your participation in chaos decreased. And that is the real transformation. Because at the highest level, strength is not about how much you can endure. It is about how much you refuse to waste yourself on. One of the most misunderstood concepts in emotional strength is boundaries. Most people hear that word and immediately associate it with distance, rejection, or coldness. They think setting boundaries means pushing people away or becoming difficult to approach, but that is not what boundaries are at all. Boundaries are not about controlling other people. They are about defining yourself. They are the invisible line that separates what you will accept from what you will not. And the moment that line is unclear, life becomes chaotic, because people begin to define it for you. And here is the uncomfortable truth. If you do not set your boundaries, someone else will set them for you, and they will always set them in their favor. That is why high-value people are not confused about what they allow in their lives. They are not emotional about it. They are not inconsistent. They are not negotiable in moments where clarity is required. They are firm, not aggressive, clear, not emotional, decisive, not reactive, because they understand something most people never learn until it is too late. Every time you tolerate something that violates your peace, you are not just enduring it. You are teaching people how to treat you. Let that sink in. Toleration is communication. Silence is communication. Over-explaining is communication. Even avoidance is communication. People are always learning from your behavior, even when you think you are not teaching anything. So when someone crosses a line and you say nothing, you are not keeping the peace. You are defining the standard. And once a low standard is accepted, it becomes the new expectation. This is how toxic dynamics quietly form, not through one big moment, but through repeated acceptance of small disrespect. A comment you laughed off but felt uncomfortable with. A boundary you ignored because you didn't want conflict. A behavior you justified because you didn't want to seem too sensitive. And slowly, without realizing it, your silence becomes permission. High-value people interrupt this cycle early, not with anger, not with emotional escalation, but with clarity. Because clarity is the highest form of boundary. They don't wait until resentment builds up. They don't store emotional debt. They don't allow disrespect to accumulate until it becomes explosive. They address it at the level where it appears, calmly, directly, without unnecessary emotion attached to it. And here is where most people struggle. They confuse setting boundaries with starting conflict, so they delay it. They soften it. They avoid it. They hope the other person will just understand, but people do not adjust to what you feel internally. They adjust to what you allow externally. So high-value people make their boundaries visible, not through threats, not through intimidation, but through consistency. If something is unacceptable, it is consistently unacceptable. Not today acceptable and tomorrow painful. Not acceptable in private and rejected in public. Consistency removes confusion, and when confusion is gone, manipulation loses its entry point. Because manipulation thrives in uncertainty. It thrives when someone is unsure whether they are being disrespected or overthinking it. It thrives when someone keeps questioning their own perception. It thrives when emotional clarity is weak. But when a boundary is clear, manipulation has no space to operate. This is why toxic people often test boundaries repeatedly, not always because they want to harm, but because they are checking for weakness in consistency. They are observing where your limits actually are, not where you say they are. And every time a boundary is ignored, it shifts, not loudly, quietly, until one day you realize you are tolerating things you once swore you never would. That is how erosion works. High-value individuals prevent erosion by being consistent from the beginning. They do not overreact, but they do not underdefine themselves either. They are calm, but firm, open, but not accessible to everything. And there is something powerful that happens when people realize this about you. They stop guessing your limits. They stop testing your patience. They stop pushing past what is clearly defined. Not because they fear you, but because they understand you. And understanding creates structure. Structure creates respect. And respect naturally reduces toxic behavior without a single argument. But there is another layer most people miss. Boundaries are not just about others. They are also about you. Because sometimes the hardest person to set boundaries with is yourself. Your own impulse to respond. Your own need to explain. Your own desire to be understood immediately. Your own urge to fix every misunderstanding. High-value people learn to set internal boundaries too. They don't let every emotion become an action. They don't let every thought become a reaction. They don't let every discomfort become a confrontation. They create space between feeling and responding. And in that space, wisdom appears. Because without that space, everything becomes reactionary. And a reactionary life is a life constantly shaped by external triggers. But a structured life is built from internal discipline. So when you set boundaries, you are not becoming rigid. You are becoming defined. And definition is what gives identity stability. Without boundaries, people lose themselves in other people's expectations, moods, and opinions. They become adaptable to everything except their own values. And that is where suffering begins. Because a life without boundaries is a life without direction. It is constantly reacting, constantly adjusting, constantly trying to maintain peace, without ever establishing it. But when boundaries are clear, something shifts fundamentally. You stop negotiating your self-respect. You stop apologizing for clarity. You stop confusing kindness with self-sacrifice. And you begin to understand that peace is not something you find in others. It is something you enforce within yourself. So the next time someone crosses a line, remember this. You are not just deciding how to respond. You are deciding who you are willing to be in that moment. And every time you choose clarity over confusion, consistency over comfort, and self-respect over approval, you are not pushing people away. You are pulling your life back into alignment. And that is where real strength begins. There is a quiet trap that most people fall into without even realizing it. It is not loud. It is not obvious. It does not feel dangerous at first. It feels like being accepted. It feels like being understood. It feels like being validated. And that is exactly why it is so powerful. The need for validation can quietly shape your entire life if you are not aware of it. It can influence your decisions, your relationships, your boundaries, and even your self-worth. You start adjusting yourself not based on what you believe is right, but based on what others might approve of. And slowly, without noticing it, you stop living from your identity and start living from approval. Now here is the deeper issue. Toxic people are often extremely skilled at recognizing this need in others. Not always consciously, but instinctively. They can sense when someone is emotionally dependent on being understood, liked, or accepted. And once they detect that, they begin to use it as leverage. Because validation, when used incorrectly, becomes a form of control. If someone can make you question yourself, they can influence your behavior. If someone can make you doubt your perception, they can reshape your reality. If someone can make you seek their approval, they can quietly position themselves above you in the emotional hierarchy of the interaction. And most people never realize this is happening because it doesn't look like control. It looks like conversation. It looks like disagreement. It looks like just opinions. But internally, something deeper is shifting. You begin to pause before speaking. You begin to second-guess your instincts. You begin to rehearse your words before expressing them. Not because you lack intelligence, but because you are slowly giving authority over your perception to someone else. High-value people break this pattern early. They understand something very important. Not everyone's approval is required for your truth to be valid. Let that settle for a moment, because most people live as if truth needs permission, as if their perspective only becomes real when it is acknowledged by someone else. Truth does not need validation. Only insecurity does. And the more you rely on external validation, the more unstable your internal world becomes. Because now your self-worth is not anchored inside you. It is floating outside of you, dependent on reactions, opinions, and interpretations you cannot control. So high-value individuals detach from that dependency, not by becoming indifferent to people, but by becoming anchored in themselves. They stop negotiating their reality. They stop rewriting their experience just to make others comfortable. They stop explaining their entire inner world just to be believed. Because they understand something simple but powerful. You are not required to be understood by everyone in order to stand firm in what you know. And this changes how they move through conflict completely. When someone misunderstands them, they don't rush to correct every detail. When someone disagrees with them, they don't immediately assume they are wrong. When someone questions their character, they don't collapse into defensive explanations. Because they are no longer using other people as a mirror for their identity. They have learned to see themselves directly. That is where emotional independence begins. Now let's go deeper into why validation becomes so addictive for many people. It often starts with discomfort. The discomfort of being misunderstood. The discomfort of silence. The discomfort of disapproval. And instead of learning to sit with that discomfort, people try to eliminate it immediately by explaining, over-justifying, or seeking agreement. But in doing so, they train themselves to need external relief every time internal discomfort appears. So over time, the nervous system begins to associate disagreement with danger and approval with safety. That is why, even in calm discussions, people can feel anxious when they are not agreed with. It is not about logic anymore. It is about emotional conditioning. High-value people interrupt this conditioning. They allow discomfort to exist without immediately reacting to it. They let disagreement remain unresolved when resolution is unnecessary. They accept that being misunderstood is sometimes part of being clear. And this is not arrogance. It is emotional maturity. Because maturity is not the absence of need. It is the ability to not be controlled by it. So when someone tries to pull them into a validation loop, they don't engage. They don't over-explain their identity. They don't chase understanding from people who are committed to misunderstanding them. They simply remain steady. And that steadiness is powerful, because it communicates something without words. I am not here to be approved. I am here to be aligned. And people who rely on control through validation begin to lose interest in that dynamic. Not because you fought them, not because you rejected them aggressively, but because you are no longer participating in the emotional game they rely on. There is no negotiation point anymore, no insecurity to exploit, no instability to trigger, and when that is gone, the dynamic naturally dissolves. But there is another important layer here. Stopping the need for validation does not mean you stop caring about connection. It means you stop confusing connection with agreement. You can respect someone without needing their approval. You can listen to someone without absorbing their judgment. You can understand someone without surrendering your identity. That distinction is where emotional strength lives. Because the moment you require validation to feel stable, you are no longer free. You are dependent on external confirmation to maintain internal peace. And anything you depend on externally can be disrupted externally. So high-value people build something different. They build internal reference points. They ask themselves, does this align with my values? Does this reflect my integrity? Does this feel true to who I am, regardless of agreement? And if the answer is yes, external validation becomes optional, not essential. That shift alone removes an enormous amount of emotional pressure from life. Because you stop living in constant anticipation of approval. You stop editing yourself for acceptance. You stop shrinking your truth to fit someone else's comfort. And you begin to speak, act, and exist from a place of internal certainty. And that certainty changes how people respond to you. Some will respect it. Some will resist it. Some will distance themselves from it. But none of that defines you anymore. Because your identity is no longer being built in the reflection of other people's opinions. It is being built in alignment with your own awareness. And that is the point where validation loses its power entirely. Not because people stop having opinions, but because you stop needing them to define your reality. And once you reach that state, something very important happens in your life. You stop chasing understanding, and you start standing in clarity. And clarity is something no external opinion can shake. There is a point in every person's life where they finally realize something uncomfortable, but undeniable. You cannot control other people. You cannot silence their opinions. You cannot stop their judgments. You cannot prevent their behavior. You cannot rewrite their intentions. And once that truth settles in, you are left with only one direction that actually gives you power. You turn inward. Because the only thing you have full authority over is yourself, your thoughts, your reactions, your discipline, your interpretation, your emotional responses. And this is where self-mastery begins. Not in controlling the world around you, but in refusing to be controlled by it. Most people misunderstand strength. They think strength is about dominance over others, being louder, being more persuasive, being more forceful, being untouchable in a social sense. But real strength has very little to do with controlling the environment. Real strength is the ability to remain stable regardless of the environment. And that is a completely different level of power, because life will always test you, not occasionally, consistently, through people who provoke you, through situations that challenge your patience, through words that are designed to destabilize you, through moments that invite you into emotional reaction. And in those moments, you are standing at a crossroads. You can react, or you can respond with awareness, and the difference between those two decisions determines the quality of your entire life. A reaction is automatic. It is emotional. It is unfiltered. It is driven by impulse and discomfort. A response is conscious. It is chosen. It is intentional. It is aligned with who you are becoming, not just what you are feeling in the moment. High-value people learn to live in that space between stimulus and response. That space is where freedom exists. Because without that space, you are not choosing your life. You are being pushed through it by external triggers. Now here is the deeper truth most people never confront. If someone can control your emotions, they can influence your behavior. If they can influence your behavior, they can shape your decisions. And if they can shape your decisions, they can quietly shape the direction of your life without ever needing permission. That is why emotional mastery is not optional for a strong life. It is essential, because every time you lose control of your emotional state, you temporarily surrender control of your clarity. And clarity is where power lives. So self-mastery begins with something very simple, but very difficult. Awareness before reaction. You notice the trigger without becoming the trigger. You observe the emotion without becoming the emotion. You recognize the pressure without surrendering to it. And in that pause, you regain authority over yourself. Most people underestimate how powerful that pause is, because in that moment, nothing outside of you has control over what happens next. Only you do. But self-mastery does not stop at emotional control. It goes deeper than that. It includes discipline over attention, because what you consistently focus on becomes your internal reality. If your attention is constantly pulled into conflict, you become mentally chaotic. If your attention is constantly consumed by negativity, you become emotionally heavy. If your attention is constantly directed toward what others are doing, you lose sight of your own path. High-value people are extremely protective of their attention, not because they are disconnected from life, but because they understand that attention is the gateway to identity. What you observe regularly becomes what you internalize. What you internalize becomes how you see the world, and how you see the world determines how you move through it. So they choose carefully. Not every situation deserves analysis. Not every insult deserves reflection. Not every opinion deserves mental space. Not every conflict deserves emotional participation, because participation is a choice, and many people participate in their own emotional disturbance without realizing it. Self-mastery is the discipline of refusing unnecessary participation. Now let's go deeper into another layer. One of the hardest parts of self-mastery is resisting the need to be understood in real time. When someone misinterprets you, the instinct is to immediately correct them. When someone challenges your character, the instinct is to defend yourself instantly. When someone questions your intentions, the instinct is to explain everything until they finally agree. But high-value individuals understand something very important. You do not need immediate validation for your truth to remain intact. Sometimes clarity takes time. Sometimes understanding is delayed. Sometimes people are not ready to see what you see. And forcing immediate understanding often leads to emotional exhaustion, not resolution. So instead of rushing to fix perception, they stay grounded in their own truth. They allow time to reveal what arguments cannot. And this is where emotional strength becomes visible. Not in how fast you react, but in how steady you remain when reaction is expected. There is also a deeper psychological shift that happens with self-mastery. You stop needing situations to change in order to feel okay. This is one of the most powerful internal freedoms a person can develop, because most people unconsciously depend on external conditions to regulate their emotions. If people are kind, They feel stable. If people are disrespectful, they feel unstable. If life is smooth, they feel in control. If life becomes chaotic, they feel lost. So their emotional world is constantly dependent on external movement. But high-value people reverse that relationship. They become the stabilizing force, not the stabilized one. They do not wait for calm environments to feel calm. They generate calm within themselves, regardless of the environment. And this changes everything. Because now, toxic behavior no longer defines their emotional state. It no longer dictates their decisions. It no longer pulls them into instability. It simply exists outside of them, without ownership over their internal world. And when people realize they no longer have emotional access to you, something shifts. They either adapt to your stability, or they detach from your presence. But either outcome strengthens your peace. Self-mastery also means accepting that not everything requires correction. Not every wrong behavior needs your involvement. Not every misunderstanding needs your explanation. Not every conflict needs your energy. Sometimes maturity is choosing silence, not out of fear, but out of clarity. Because you realize that engaging in certain situations does not elevate anything. It only drains you. And high-value people become extremely efficient with their energy in this way. They don't react to everything. They don't fix everything. They don't engage everything. They choose. And choice is where freedom lives. Because when you are no longer emotionally reactive and no longer externally dependent, something powerful happens. You become grounded in yourself, unmoved by unnecessary noise, unshaken by external tension, uncontrolled by other people's behavior. And at that point, you are no longer living defensively. You are living intentionally. And that is the highest form of strength. Because self-mastery is not about becoming superior to others. It is about becoming fully responsible for yourself. And the moment you achieve that, something becomes very clear. No toxic person, no negative environment, and no external chaos can define your inner world anymore. Because you are no longer available for control. You are only available for alignment. And that is the final shift. When you no longer need the world to behave differently in order for you to be at peace, you become untouchable in the only way that truly matters. Internally free. And once you reach that state, you realize something profound. Nothing outside of you was ever in control of you in the first place, unless you allowed it to be.